Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, it has been 5 weeks since India revoked Article 370 of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and imposed a blanket curfew across the state. 5 weeks there has been unspeakable horror going on behind the clampdown with civilians on the hands of security forces. Over 1 million military and paramilitary forces are stationed in every nook and cranny of Indian-occupied Kashmir. The population of 8 million people are facing severe food shortages, medicine shortages. Doctors are pleading for help from the central government, and those doctors, as a result, for speaking out, are being picked up and vanished. Now, religious festivals, whether it was Eid and other commemorations, are shunned and people are told to stay indoors. Innocent school children are being picked up in the dead of the night by Indian military forces. Others are being beaten to a pulp. Horrifying accounts of gross human rights violations are being reported by international organizations. The curfew remains in place today as well on the 9th of Muharram, when in practice, thousands step out in peaceful droves for the annual procession commemorating the death anniversary of the Prophet's grandson. Meanwhile, India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval says Pakistan is sending over 200 terrorists across the line of control. But how does one take these statements seriously when just last week they have been caught red-handed fabricating stories of militants from Pakistan who were in fact farmers who had accidentally crossed the line of control, information of which was intimated to the Indian side during their weekly hotline with the Pakistani authorities. So the question really we're looking to investigate today is, what is India's agenda? How far will they go in order to portray an image of normalcy, which Pakistan completely rejects, that is going on in Indian-occupied Kashmir? So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. We are joined by Mr. Imran Yawar, former ambassador in our Islamabad studios today. Welcome, Mr. Yawar. So good to have you. And also we have Mr. Riyaz. He's a researcher and a research associate, also a PhD candidate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs in Istanbul, in Ankara actually, at the Zaim University. And of course we have Air Vice Marshal Shahzad Chaudhry, an analyst joining us from Islamabad. Welcome to all three of you. Really appreciate that you took out the time today to speak to us about what is underway here in Indian-occupied Kashmir. I want to start with you, Mr. Yawar, if we could get your take on how the latest statement of this entire sort of pitch that Pakistan is involved in constructing a sort of a militant insurgency, sending over 200 militants across the line of control. What is your thoughts on what Ajit Doval has just come out and said?
Well, you see, what India is talking about, or what Indian leadership is talking about, it's a scary thought. The thought of false flag operation. It's scary, it's disturbing, particularly because of its outcome. The Prime Minister of Pakistan has repeatedly cautioned the international community about the possibilities of runaway, or the risk of runaway nuclear escalation as a result of these false flag operations. But we need to understand this from the Indian perspective also. We need to understand why India is warmongering. We need to understand why they are raising the hype. There is a method behind this madness. Kashmir is burning. There is gross human rights violations taking place. The whole valley is in a clampdown. There's a human rights violations. The people, their activities are restrained to their home.
Let me come back to you. Let me quickly get also Mr. Riyaz Khaliq here. Mr. Khaliq, you heard Mr. Yawar there talking about the dire situation, that is the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And then we hear statements coming out about portraying Pakistan as being the reason behind why they have to really notch up the security and do this clampdown. What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. It is simple. Kashmir is under clampdown since August 4-5 night. That was the last time I spoke and saw my mother, my father, my brothers. And then it is now 36th day in a row that there is no direct connection with my family. It was after 20 days that I spoke to one of my former colleagues who is a journalist who was able to reach my family around 15 kilometers from city center, that I sent a voice message which he downloaded and made my family hear that. And from there, my family sent a 4 minutes long voice message to reach to me. And it came to me after 4 days. And then after 24 days, my father and my mother were able to speak to me for 1 minute. They said they found internet somewhere at a friend's place, and there is a long line that we are only able to speak for a minute. What I'm trying to say by saying this, I'm a student thousands of miles away from my home, is that clampdown is in Kashmir. State has enforced it. Internet has been cut down. Local phone lines are cut down. There is no communication among the people who are living in the territory.
Mr. Chaudhry, if we could get your take on this, especially I keep coming back to what India's National Security Advisor keeps, his statement, Mr. Ajit Doval, where he said essentially that 200, pointing the blame here at Pakistan, warmongering, as Mr. Yawar earlier on said. Where is India taking this conversation? How far do you think they are willing to go with this?
I think it's pretty according to the Indian script, and the Indian script is very clear. There is no madness. It's a very clearly enunciated plan. The troops had begun to move in before the decision to take the matter to the Indian Parliament and then turn it into a law. So that was done after the troops had moved in. Now remember, who were the replacing? I think it's about 38,000 new troops, additional troops beyond the 750,000 that were already present. And then when you add up the paramilitaries and the police, etc., then it makes 1 million almost, as you mentioned. So if that is the kind of a figure that is already there, and the ones that came in fresh, 38,000, they actually replaced those army troops that were now stationed within the urban areas. And all these 38,000 then moved to the line of control. So the line of control, to our understanding, is now manned almost an inch to an inch. For that matter, to lay a blame then on Pakistan that some 200 infiltrators are coming in, I don't know which way or what route are they taking to come into Kashmir, because India has it all covered from all sides. And in fact, it's portraying and projecting a threat onto Pakistan. So I find that the reason why India does that is simply because of the fact that it knows that the longer it wants to keep the Kashmir closed to the Kashmiris and to the world, then it must create a bogey of some sort of an external threat, whether it is irregulars, whether it is the Pakistanis or some other infiltrators or whatever they want to mention. And the reason is to keep the clasps on to Kashmir as they have managed to do since August 5. That's an unfortunate part. It is, of course, turning into now a huge humanitarian issue. And the world needs to take a look at it and see the design behind this entire Indian maneuver.
And the problem, Mr. Yawar, is also that only should the world take notice by now. And while they do, the UNSC meeting could be seen in a way of taking on this issue finally after, say, 50 years or so. We're still not seeing more than just advisory comments coming that escalations should go down, Pakistan and India should talk. What we're seeing, at the other hand, in Indian-occupied Kashmir is that on a day like 9th Muharram, where droves of people come out to commemorate the death anniversary of the Prophet's grandson, it's a peaceful, it's a religious activity. It is important to the hearts and souls of the people who practice it, and they are being showered upon by pellet guns. They are being beaten by sticks by the police and the military officers there. When this kind of situation unfolds, do you think it is enough to get the kind of attention it needs before it blows out of proportion?
See, you're absolutely right. The response of the international community to the atrocities being committed inside Kashmir has been very muted. It's a sort of inhumane silence there of the international community. The world needs to know, the world needs to be told about the atrocities being committed there. The world needs to understand that there's gross human rights violations taking place and the people are suffering. But then I think we should not be surprised at what is happening there. morality hardly plays a role in modern day realpolitik. Right. And I don't think it ever played a role in politics ever. Human rights do matter, but only when national interests are not at stake. Okay. For this issue to be resolved, international community has to mediate. Otherwise, this thing can, as the Prime Minister has said, there is the risk of runaway nuclear escalation. And of course, the consequences would be great. So international community has to take account, and I believe that international community is monitoring the event, but I fear it is doing it from the wrong end of the prism. It is monitoring the situation from India's perspective that all is well there. Well, all is not well there. There are people suffering. The people are being deprived of their basic needs. There's human rights violation taking place. So the world has to understand that. Right. But I think at the same time that things are not that bleak. There is a growing condemnation of India and its actions there. The international leaders are talking about it. Of course, the international media has covered the event, and they are critical of the Indian policies there.
The condemnation, however, is the point whether the condemnation goes beyond just words into actions. And Mr. Khaliq, let me ask you this: while we're talking about the image that India portrays, that everything is normal, and then AFP reports of just today what is happening, how different processions are trying to come out, are out on the streets, and they are being pelted by guns and by pellet guns and bamboo sticks. You, I understand, are not in touch with your family. It is a very difficult time for you also. You're barely getting any minutes of conversation across in the span of 5 weeks. But is this unprecedented in terms of the kind of crackdown Kashmiris are seeing at this point?
See, I would like every one of us refer to a recent report, News Behind Barbed Wire. A group of journalists and activists have visited Kashmir, and they released it last week, wherein they clearly mention that the state narrative of quote-unquote normalcy is dominant. Why? Because reporters, journalists on ground are unable to even move out of the city center to gather information, what is happening on ground, and then to disseminate it, to send it to their offices. Mm-hmm. There is a government media facilitation center, right, having only 4 computers. Mm-hmm. And then there is low internet availability. There is no WhatsApp. They have to send emails, stories through their emails, and they are registered, checked what they do, what they send. And then plus over that, when the stories are published, the reporters who file that, they are questioned. It is the report mentions it, that they are questioned about their quote-unquote sensitive stories.
When the media comes out with reports, when the government is being advised, or the government advises how to control Kashmir, explain to us what they are referring to when they say control.
Mm-hmm. The control is to stop information coming out of what is happening on ground, whatever it is happening. Whether it is injuries, what I say is the basic right to life, right to move out, to do our business.
So the narrative, you're saying they're trying to control the narrative, and the only reason they would want to control the narrative is because it doesn't align with what they have been saying all this time.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that is what it is. This is the reports, those who visited Kashmir, they say it. And to understand that, we need to go to the report by Ministry of Internal Affairs or Home Affairs of India, which in its own report said in 2017, following the popular uprising in Kashmir in 2016, to how to control Kashmir narrative, you need to do these 3 things. First, right. Second thing, but right now what has happened is the international media has been able to break this logjam. The stories, the kind of reportage which has been done by AFP, AP, writers, Washington Post, New York Times, and other allied media has been commendable, in short to say. So they have been, in a way, tried to break that logjam which is imposed on Kashmir.
Right.
Yeah.
So international media, you're saying, is coming out with credible report. On the other hand, the Indian government continues to deny, saying this is all fake news. I mean, we saw on August 10th how BBC's footage was highly contested by the Indian government. But coming back to you, Mr. Chaudhry, this is not just a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding anymore. This is also the potential of two nuclear-armed neighbors going neck to neck at this, because this constant allegations of one to the other that a false flag operation will trigger or be the last straw that breaks the camel's back is a big concern, isn't it?
If India dares into that kind of an adventure, I don't think that it's going to then remain contained. Of course, all of us military minds in both countries, we know very well that how dynamics of a war can become uncontrolled and can become escalatory in nature. So that is established. But again, the military minds are also the best minds to decide whether they want to step into a situation which will snowball, for example. And so therefore, I'm very clear that I don't think India will ever take that risk, because if it takes that risk, then it is not only the Kashmiris, it's not only the Pakistani side of the LOC, it shall have to be all of India which will come into the equation. And I don't think Indians want to give that pay that kind of a price for a misadventure.
But Mr. Yawar, would you agree with Mr. Chaudhry is saying here that India wouldn't want to go there, considering that India has a pretty long rap sheet when it comes to the kind of operations it has pulled off in order to instigate something or claim that Pakistan was behind it, whether we're talking about Pathankot airbase incident or the Uri incident or even the Pulwama incident in recent history has taken place?
Sanity would dictate that such an action should not be taken. Going on, escalating the tensions, that would be madness of the 12th hour. I don't think even the devil would be ready to tread on this path, because the devastation would be unparalleled. So the best thing obviously is that the two sides sit together and they discuss, resolve the issues through dialogue and understanding. And of course, for these dialogues also to succeed, India must know that it has to relax its hold on the Kashmiris, give them space to breathe. Only then this situation. But I agree with Marshall that India would not venture on such a path.
Okay, coming back to you here, Ms. Like, if you think what is unfolding here in Indian-occupied Kashmir could have anything to sort of go in line with how Prime Minister Modi's leadership since 2014 has been seen and criticized as intentionally increasing the war hysteria against Pakistan?
See, as a Kashmiri, I would see it like this. The first aim right now, after 36 days of lockdown plus, which is apparent now that even though the government in Kashmir, the local authorities claim that the restrictions have been eased, then why don't people come out? So is it civil disobedience happening now? So the focus first, all the parties involved in Kashmir, the focus first should be to end the logjam, let people have a sigh of relief.
So Chaudhry, I just want to get your closing remarks on this issue, especially in light of how, on the flip side, what we're seeing in Afghanistan is essentially not just an impasse, but the breakdown of these peace talks that have been going on for almost a year now between the US and the Taliban. And the allegations or the analysis earlier on was that India, feeling blighted, not being part of this conversation, was also using this as a distraction tactic for Pakistan. Do you think that this, if you agree with that analysis, do you think this would have an impact now on how this story moves forward?
Well, I think if the agreement had been concluded, I don't think the situation in Afghanistan would have changed overnight. There would have been a new kind of a turmoil, and that turmoil would have extracted a new challenge on Pakistan. So I don't think that it would have eased matters for Pakistan in any form or manner. If at all, paradoxically, if the Americans continue to stay, it is possible to, through them, still be able to contain some of the more nastier elements which continue to impact Pakistan. So there is a benefit in a certain way. And of course, but in the longer term, you don't find benefit, because till the time Afghanistan actually settles, whether it's going to be one phase completion of one phase.
But essentially what I'm asking is, sorry to interrupt you, but essentially what I'm asking is, does this change the modus operandi of Prime Minister Modi on Kashmir?
Not really. I don't think so. That was ever a consideration. I think his aims on Kashmir were entirely insidious. They were well known. They were well established. And he's played his cards at the time that he thought was most appropriate, which was, and I don't think it had anything to do with Afghanistan or lack of Indian sort of toehold in Afghanistan as we perceived it, which was never the case. India always had an influence, and I think it will continue to enjoy that influence in Afghanistan.
Okay, Mr. Yawar, just quickly, last 30 seconds, your closing remarks on how far do you think the BJP-led government is going to go with the kind of clampdown we're seeing in Indian-occupied Kashmir?
Even senior voices inside India, they are talking and they are critical about the action of the government of Mr. Modi. Therefore, India is under immense pressure, and this, as I said, pressure would continue to increase. They have obviously this thing cannot continue for long. And what scares India is the reaction of the Kashmiris once the curfew is lifted and people come out. Much would depend on that.
Right. Okay, there, Mr. Yawar, thank you for taking out the time, and also Mr. Khaliq and Air Vice Marshal Mr. Shahzad Chaudhry. Thank you so much for speaking to us here on Newswire. We've come to the part of the show where we have to take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. I'm Ayza Omar and you're watching Newswire. A secret meeting between the US President, Taliban, and Afghanistan's president at Camp David were cancelled at the last minute by President Donald Trump himself. Now, he tweeted that he was calling them off because the Taliban, who admitted to a deadly Kabul bombing that killed 12 people, including one US soldier, was using it as false leverage. Now, this comes only a few days after the 9th round of peace talks concluded between the US and the Taliban leadership in Doha, Qatar, where, according to the US envoy to Afghanistan's Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, a peace deal was agreed on principle, a draft of which was also presented to the Afghan president. Now, the Taliban have called the move to call off these peace negotiations an example of US's anti-peace stance and warned that US had more to lose from this. So what is behind the US president's decision, and what does it mean for the future of negotiations if they're going to be any? Let's find out from our guest. We have today Mr. Chris Alexander, former ambassador, joining us from Toronto. He's also the former deputy special representative of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan back in 2009. Also, we have with us Mr. Hashim Wahdatyar, an analyst and director at the Institute of Current World Affairs, joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for taking out the time. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Alexander. We were talking about, if you're looking at what analysts are saying right now and the comments coming in on what was behind the U.S. move here, they're questioning if this killing of a soldier, and this is, of course, related to the Kabul attack outside Green Village, where a lot of these NGOs and foreign workers are living. And so a U.S. soldier was killed, what President Trump also tweeted about, whether this was the sole reason or that, and if that was the case, it really brings into question that just in the past year, we've seen 16 U.S. servicemen killed. So what is your take on why he might have made this move?
Well, I think there are two reasons. The first one you pointed to, it isn't just a question of that one attack which killed one U.S. service member, as well as a Romanian soldier. It's an escalating pattern of violence in recent weeks. Mm-hmm. And that's not the dynamic you expect on the eve of a peace agreement from your main interlocutor. You want to be building confidence. You want to show that there are dividends from peace that are going to be a benefit to everyone. And this showed the opposite. Secondly, though, we have to keep in mind that this was not a peace agreement that was being negotiated. This was a withdrawal agreement and a series of undertakings from the Taliban in return for lower U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan. The peace agreement, if and when it comes, will be negotiated by the Afghan government. They have not been party to the talks up until now. And there was growing disaffection on the part of Kabul, which is going into a presidential election very shortly, about the exclusion of the legitimate institutions and the elected representatives of Afghanistan from the talks. And I think that created pressures that brought the process apart. It will come back together, I'm sure, in one form or another. But there's no substitute, in my view, for direct talks between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan.
Right. Okay. So, but let me bear in this conversation, Mr. Wahdatyar, if we're talking about this, do you agree, first of all, with what Mr. Alexander has said here? And also, I'd like to hear your comments on whether this sort of, if this is really just a threat, in a way, like a bluff move, is this Trump also now kind of trying to use his leverage?
Well, let me first of all say that the Trump street and the Trump stand as an ad hoc is because that the United States is trying to pressurize the Taliban to agree to some of the terms of the United States. For instance, the presence of some counterterrorism teams in Afghanistan that the Taliban refrain. Number two, that is that in the beginning, the Taliban were claiming for a quarter of cake. Now they are asking for the whole cake. In the beginning, the Taliban political figures in Qatar, they were asking that they will join the other Afghans and form a government. And they are fighting only for the withdrawing of the U.S. international forces in Afghanistan. But now their demands is going higher. Mm-hmm. The next steps is that unless the Taliban genuinely shows that they are after bringing peace to Afghanistan, not returning the Taliban regime and emirates in Afghanistan, there should not be a peace talks. One. Second, the United States, one thing that can tell you that in one tweet, Donald Trump changed things dramatically, but that is not a decision. Remember, very soon there will be either another tweet or the United States with a different way will go back to the peace talks, which is very important for the Afghan people and also for the international community. But this will be with a different approach talking to Taliban, and these talks will be conditional, conditionally talking with the Taliban. If the United States do not involve in a peace talks with the Taliban, I can tell you that this peace process will be hijacked by some other countries. Mm-hmm. Moscow is already a competitor to Washington, D.C. There were two events in Moscow about a peace talks with the Taliban and a so-called intra-Afghan dialogue, and the Taliban representatives were there in Moscow. China can intervene. Some other countries can intervene. So that is the process. You hear yesterday, Jawad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, already say that they are ready to take this process. Of course, the Afghans will not want that. Right. So what we want is that the United States should continue the process, but at the same time, they should pressure the Taliban to stop violence and killing the innocent people in Afghanistan.
But here, Mr. Alexander, let me take forward this question to what you were also saying earlier, that if they were so perturbed by the escalating violence and to see that the attacks were increasing from the Taliban side, even though I must mention here the last several weeks have seen attacks by ISIS, by Daesh, and there are an ongoing debate that the American forces within Afghanistan are in a way also providing protection to some of them in the northeast part of Afghanistan. So not getting into that, but essentially this has been going on for the past year, these 9 rounds of talks that have reached. Why now are they concerned? I mean, even Ashraf Ghani himself said that 45,000 soldiers, Afghan soldiers, have died since 2014. Why wake up to this reality now?
Well, I think people were hoping over the course of those 9 rounds of negotiation and the deepening rapport that we all hoped would emerge between the U.S. Representatives and the Taliban, that confidence would be built, trust would deepen on the basis of an improving security situation. That has not happened. And one has to ask the real question here, who calls the shots? Who controls the military agenda of the Taliban? My own view as an Afghanistan expert is that the people around the table in Doha do not exercise political or military control over the commanders in the field, and that those decisions are being made elsewhere.
But Mr. Alexander, it almost seems that the way these Doha talks have been constructed, there isn't really an option. I mean, they're so keen on listening to what the Taliban want, how they want it, who should attend the talks. It doesn't seem like the Afghan government even has a choice to be at this table.
And that's the problem. And that's one of the reasons they were expressing increasingly urgent signs of concern. Will the Afghan elections take place this fall? What will the peace process mean to those elections if it continues? But there is an option, there is an alternative, and that is for these talks to end and for the country and the region to go back to the conflict that has gone on for far too long. And I think no one wants that. There is more determined political will in all the countries you mentioned to bring this conflict to an end. But to do that, you need to bring the right people to the table, the real decision makers. And I think that has to involve the government of Afghanistan, the government of Pakistan, as well as the other key players, the United States, the Taliban itself, and so forth. The Taliban, though, here are actually junior players. They are proxies for the real players. And until that starts to come out, and that is recognized in the structure of talks, I think we're going to see a process that is more or less meaningless.
Okay, more or less meaningless. But then at the same time, Wahdatyar, let me ask you this. Now, President Trump said that nobody really knew about this. Nobody knew about this private secret meeting that was to take place at Camp David, but I canceled it over this false leverage that the Taliban think they have. Now, let me just ask you this. One of the two parties that were going to attend was the President Ashraf Ghani, right? The government of Kabul, which the Taliban have continuously said, we don't recognize the US stooge, it's the US puppet. What exactly do you think President Trump was hoping to achieve when he secretly had them both show up in Camp David?
Well, actually, the presidential elections will take place here in the United States. In these peace talks, there are interests that everybody is trying to have. In the beginning of the process, everybody was interested to have peace in Afghanistan, but later on they wanted to have their own type of peace by all the involved parties. So then the Quetta Shura of the Taliban, the Supreme Council of the Taliban, I believe that did not allow the political figures in Qatar or the deputy leader of the Taliban, who is based in Qatar, Mullah Baradar, to go to Washington, D.C. and have a meeting with President Donald Trump. And that is a reason he refrained going to Washington, D.C. That was one of the reasons, I can say. But taking the opportunity, let me highlight that even before having President Donald Trump having stand on this to sit back from the peace talks at this moment, there were a couple of other doubts also from the Congress of the United States on this process. From some of the defense secretary of the United States. Not only within the United States, some figures were having doubt on this process, but even from the countries of the region and the Afghan government, the Afghan people, because any peace deal, if there is, that should not take place behind the closed doors. The Afghan people are paying the price every day, so they should be involved, or at least they should be aware what's going on about their destiny in long way, far city, Qatar, Doha, so they should be involved. So these doubts were not externals, but there were internal doubts as well. There were some, like the political figures in Qatar they have by now 2 years experience working with international community. They travel a lot to Moscow, to China, Indonesia, to Tehran, and to some other countries, Uzbekistan. So they are trying to adjust within the international standards. However, the military commissions of the Taliban who are in the battlefield, they are insisting on the fight, and they think that they can win the war because the SIGAR announced a few months back that the Taliban controls 50% of the territory, but the Taliban say that they are controlling 70% of the territory. So the military commissions on the ground say that why we are talking with our enemy. So they think that they can control the whole country, and they think that they can
there's a
defeat
divide.
the international
There's a
community.
huge. So you're saying, Mr. Wahdatyar, that there is a divide within the Taliban ranks, and this is a lot along the lines of what Mr. Alexander was also pointing out, that those people who need to be at the table to have this conversation for these peace talks or negotiations to move forward should be the right people. Now, what is one to do about this factuous sort of arrangement, which from, it seems, the get-go is started on the wrong foot? The wrong people are negotiating with each other.
Well, let me tell you that from the Taliban side, I think the right person is Mullah Baradar, who is very, very influential on the Taliban. But the problem is that the Taliban is not one united group. There are a number of groups, and I can tell you, even if the Taliban do a negotiation and come to a deal and ink the deal, I can tell you that thousands of the Taliban followers will go and join the ISK, Islamic State of Khorasan in Afghanistan. That's what I can tell you. Because the goal, the aim that the Taliban are fighting in Afghanistan, that's not one aim. There are thousands of Taliban, they are trying to fight for bringing Sharia law in all over the country. There are other thousands of Taliban that are just fighting for the withdrawal of international forces. But there are also thousands of Taliban who are fighting to bring the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. There are thousands of other Taliban who are fighting just for the criminal purposes because there is profit in war. There is no
absolutely
profit in
war. Now, hold that thought, Mr. Wahdatyar. I want to bring this to you, Mr. Alexander. The concern, again, let's go a few more steps back now. It's not even just the wrong Taliban that are having this conversation, but from what we're learning from Mr. Wahdatyar, that the intention is all wrong. I mean, this is what the Congress has also criticized Trump for, that why have this conversation with those who you declare terrorists, who were behind the plotting of what unfolded on 9/11. So, I mean, is this something that you agree with? Do you see the basic flaw here?
Talking is always better than fighting. And it is positive to see representatives of the Taliban at a table talking directly to the United States. That was not the case only a few years ago. And I said, let's be clear, it's been 10 years that the international community has been endorsing the idea of talks with the Taliban to bring this conflict to a close. The direct context that we were looking for, that we in the United Nations were trying to bring about, only started a couple of years ago. And this is on the back of a conflict, as you know, that has gone on for most of our lifetimes.
Yep.
So the issues here are complex, the waters run deep, and talking is better than turning a cold shoulder. That said, there are misconceptions on the part of many observers about the Taliban. Mullah Baradar is an important commander, a ruthless commander who has a lot of civilian lives on his hands. He's one of the architects of the policy of suicide bombing. He's one of the architects of the policy of killing civilians indiscriminately to cow and strike fear in the population.
Do you think this is the time where regional powers would find the opportunity to step in, and I'm talking about China and Russia here, in filling up a vacuum that might be left behind by the US at this stage?
If they have a positive role to play, absolutely. But the US is not heading for the exits. Donald Trump campaigned on pointing out the mistake Barack Obama had made by withdrawing precipitously the last US soldiers from Iraq, which brought about a vacuum, which brought about the creation of ISIS.
Okay.
My sense is that the US is not about to make that mistake again, and any withdrawal conditions-based. It will have to be in return for real steps towards peace, which means less violence.
Less violence. Mr. Wahdatyar, sorry, Mr. Alex, we're running out of time. Mr. Wahdatyar, your take on this very quickly. This being just a bluff or a leverage point by President Trump, how do you see this moving forward?
The moving forward will be that the peace talks would resume with a different approach, conditionals. And I can tell you that if any peace deals happen in Afghanistan, there is a need for for some numbers of international forces on the Afghan soil to police this agreement. Otherwise, Afghanistan will turn to be a hotbed of the international terrorism once again.
All right. Thank you so much there, Mr. Wahdatyar and Mr. Alexander, for taking out the time to talk to us about what is unfolding here when it comes to the negotiations between the US and the Taliban. Unfortunately, we've run out of time and we will be seeing you tomorrow. So till then, take care and goodbye.